Hey guys, welcome to IPTAX Foundations, and today we're going to be going over dealing ranges. All right, so just as a preface, above every high there are buy stops, and below every low there are sell stops. And buy stops refer to the buy orders that are resting at or above the high, and then sell stops refer to the sell orders that are resting at or below the lows. And when we take out both buy side and sell side liquidity, that is when a dealing range is created. And a dealing range is also considered a high probability pricing sequence because there are multiple PD arrays that would prevent price from negating the dealing range. And there are two types of dealing ranges that we are concerned with, the classical dealing range or the type 1 dealing range and the type 2 dealing range, which is that other dealing range. All right, and then this next slide is the science behind a dealing range. So let me pull up the annotations real quick. And then these are the different phases that happen when a dealing range is being created. So first we have the engineering phase where buy side and sell side liquidity is being engineered. And then we have the neutralizing phase where one side of the dealing range gets taken. And then the distribution phase, which is right here. So we have neutralize and then distribute. That's when the other side of the dealing range gets taken out. And then if you guys remember from that last slide, I said that a dealing range is created when both buy side and sell side liquidity are taken. So in this example, we take out all the buy side liquidity above that high, and then we take out all of the sell side liquidity below that low. So this would create a dealing range. And then just to avoid confusion, we'll call the neutralize phase phase 1, and then we'll call the distribute phase phase 2, and then we'll call the rebalance phase phase 3, and then we'll call the redeliver phase phase 4. So right here, we get 1 when we take out buy side liquidity, and then we get 2 once we take out sell side liquidity, and then we'll get 3 once we go back into that range and then rebalance. So that becomes our phase 3. And then we'll get phase 4 once we take out phase 2. So phase 2 gets taken out by phase 4 right here. And this is a dealing range. So right here, just to recap, we have buy side liquidity being taken, which gives us 1. And then we have sell side liquidity being taken, which gives us 2. And then we have price coming back inside the range and then rebalancing, which gives us phase 3. And then price exits the range, and then that gives us phase 4. So that would be an example of a bearish dealing range. Now let me give you guys an example of a bullish dealing range. So yeah, let's just use the same color. So we have price engineering liquidity. And just so you guys know, it can either engineer liquidity by a consolidation, or it can do something like this as well. So for this instance, since we have a bullish dealing range, let's say we have something like this, right? And then price takes out sell side liquidity, and then it takes out buy side liquidity. So let's just draw those phases in. So we have sell side liquidity being taken, which is our neutralizes phase. So that's 1. And then we have buy side liquidity being taken, which is number 2, which is that distribute. And then we have phase 3 come in, which would be that return back to that range. So that is phase 3. And then we have phase 4 come in after we take out 2. So this is what we expect out of a classical dealing range. So these two examples that I drew in for you guys would be examples of a classical dealing range. And that's the science behind it. So instead of hearing me say neutralize, distribute, rebalance, and redeliver, you'll see me say 1, 2, 3, and 4, just because it's easier to understand that way. So that's kind of how I'm going to approach these different phases of a dealing range from here on out. But yeah, so this is basically the science behind the dealing range. And then now let's take a look at the next slide. All right, so this is a classical bullish dealing range, and I drew a picture of that for you guys in the last slide, but we'll take a look at just the price action as well. So just reading the definition, this type of dealing range forms when price first sweeps sell side liquidity, then takes buy side liquidity. So right here, you can see that we have our sell side liquidity pool resting right here. And then we see that price takes that out, and then it takes out the buy side liquidity, right? Buy side liquidity is resting above that high right there. And then we see price come back inside that range, right? And then that gives us phase 3, as I have marked out on the chart. And then we expect phase 3 to take out phase 4. So, and then we see price takes out we expect phase 4 to take out phase 2. So we have 1, 2, 3 comes back into the range, and then 4 should take out 2 right here, as I have written right there. And then that's exactly what we see there as well. So this is a classical bullish dealing range. Now let's take a look at the next example. All right, so this is a classical bearish dealing range, which is just the opposite. So this type of dealing range forms when price first sweeps buy side liquidity, then takes sell side liquidity. So as you guys can see here, we have buy side liquidity resting above that high, and then price takes it out. And then we have sell side liquidity resting below that low. So price takes out buy side liquidity, which gives us 1, takes out sell side liquidity, which gives us 2, and then it returns back to that range, which gives us 3, and then we expect 4 to take out 2, which it does here. There might be a little bit of a broker differential here, but the idea is for 4 to draw towards 2, and then we see that right here. So this is a classical bearish dealing range. So these are the two examples of the classical dealing ranges. Now let's go and take a look at the type 2 dealing ranges in the next slide. All right, so this is an example of a type 2 bullish dealing range. And then this type of dealing range is similar to a classical bearish dealing range, except for the fact that 4 fails to take out 2 and instead takes out 3. And when this happens, 1 becomes the draw on liquidity. So let me just draw this in for you guys pictorially. So let's say that we have a buy side liquidity pool there, and then a sell side liquidity pool right there. All right, and then let's just make it a different color. So let's say that price takes out buy side liquidity right here, which gives us 1, and then it takes out sell side liquidity right here, which gives us 2. Now, typically, what we expect is we expect for price to go up and then come back down and take out 2, but that's not always the case. So that's when we get a type 2 dealing range. And in this case, it would be a type 2 bullish dealing range. So that happens when price comes back up, it forms 3 as expected, and then 4 will fail to take out 2, and then instead it'll take out 3. So when 4 fails to take out 2 and instead takes out 3, that's when 1 becomes the draw on liquidity. So that's when price will go over towards 1. And then we see price goes and takes out 1 right there. And then let's take a look at this example right here. So we have buy side liquidity resting at this high, sell side liquidity at this low. Price takes out the buy side liquidity above that high, gives us 1, and then it comes back down, takes out sell side liquidity, and then gives us phase 2. And then it comes up right here, and then it gives us phase 3. And then what we expect is for phase 3 to lead to phase 4, which would take out 2. But since that doesn't happen, 4 fails to take out 2, but that by itself doesn't mean anything. So when 4 fails to take out 2 and instead takes out 3, that's when we anticipate for 1 to become the draw on liquidity. And then as you guys can see there, price retraces into this fair value gap, and then it takes off. So that would be an example of a type 2 bullish dealing range. Or you can think of it as a bearish dealing range that failed. All right, so let's take a look at the next example. All right, so this is a type 2 bearish dealing range. And then this type of dealing range is similar to the classical bullish dealing range, except for the fact that 4 fails to take out 2 and instead takes out 3. So therefore, 1 becomes the drawn liquidity. So let's just draw this in real quick. So we have sell side liquidity, buy side liquidity, and then we have price comes down, takes out SSL, comes up, takes out buy side liquidity above that high, and then that gives us 3. And then typically we would anticipate for 4 to take out 2, which is here. But in this case, it fails. So 4 fails to take out 2 and instead takes out 3. So when that happens, 1 becomes the draw on liquidity. And then we see that price draws towards this level. And then that's what we see there. So in this example, it hasn't exactly taken out 1 yet, but we can see that price is clearly drawing to that level. And that's the logic that I kind of want to illustrate. So let's just take a look at this example in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, there's sell side liquidity below that low, and then there's buy side liquidity above these highs. Price takes out sell side liquidity first, and then that gives us 1. And then it takes out buy side liquidity, which gives us 2. And then when both buy side and sell side liquidity are taken, that confirms to us that there's a dealing range in play. And then we see that price comes back into the range here and then gives us 3. And then 4 fails to take out 2. And instead, we see that price later comes out and takes out 3. So that means that this low right here, where 1 is going to be the next draw on liquidity. And then we can see that price is drawing towards those levels. So yeah, that's pretty much everything about a dealing range. But let me just go over one more thing. So if you remember from the first slide, I say that a dealing range is a high probability pricing sequence. Now, what I mean when I say that a dealing range is a high probability pricing sequence is that there's multiple PD arrays that's within a dealing range. So right here, we have a low, a lower low, and the high right here. So we have a breaker, right? And then we have this order block, and then we have multiple fair value gaps within price. So there's all these PD arrays. So in this example, it was a failed bullish dealing range. So there's all these different things that are opposing price from going lower. But when we do see that price takes out 3, that's when we know that this dealing range is kind of failing and that there's a very, very high likelihood that price is going to go attack 1. So even though the high probability buying failed here, we can just get back into the market and then aim for this low right here. Because as I mentioned earlier, a dealing range is a high probability pricing sequence. So now let's take a look at this on a classical dealing range. So let's just use this one for an example. So right here we have a high, higher high, this low right here. So that gives us kind of this breaker at this level. And then we see these fair value gaps in price all here. And then we have this order block. And then we have all of these multiple PD arrays, which oppose price from going higher. And then in this case, you can see that it holds up and then price does eventually take out that liquidity below there. So that's what I mean when I say that a dealing range is a high probability pricing sequence. And even though you may be wrong at times, so let's say that, this short didn't work out from here. Well, you know that there's the other type of dealing range. So if the dealing range doesn't hold up as a classical dealing range, then you can always get back in with the anticipation that it could be a type 2 dealing range, and then it takes out that high. So even when you're wrong, you can always correct your mistakes when you see a dealing range. So that's also what I mean when I say that it's a high probability pricing sequence. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for today's video. I hope you guys understand a little bit more about dealing ranges, and then I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Cheers.